I didn't even say anything to Benji. It still blows me away. What a miracle. What a miracle that was. We already have 2 8-year-olds. Popping in my head was, what about that little girl with the little crossed eyes?
I know I can climb up, 'cause you're the ground beneath it all, and you make anywhere feel like home. Home isn't where we live, it's living by your side. Oh, and I can't imagine any other way. The way our world needs your touch. You're touching every space, and how it makes any place feel like home. Feel like home.
Hey guys, welcome back to Not Enough Nelsons. If you have not seen part 1 of why I adopted 9 kids, you're gonna wanna go back and watch that one first. So I'm starting right where I left off of that story. So after dinner, and Cassidy had kind of just dropped that bomb on our hearts, we decided to start looking. And so our hearts were leading us to Russia, and we decided to look up some of the orphanages there and some of the kids that were available. And so how I would describe it is you're just scrolling through all of these beautiful children, and for me and for Benji, what kind of happened is one of the children just kind of pop off the screen and they look real. It's like the other kids are beautiful children, but they don't almost look real. They look like a picture of a child, and maybe perhaps the child that's meant for you looks real. And so this specific child looked really real to us, and his name was Alexander, and he was adorable, and he just looked so real to Benji and I, and so we started the process. Now I'm gonna leave out some of the names and the details about Bridger, because some of the things that he's been through in his life are not for me to share. That would be for him to share one day if he wants to. And also some of the people involved in his adoption, I want to protect their privacy as well. So for the sake of these experiences, I will just call this person friend. And so after Benji and I decided to adopt, we had a friend come over, and she was really cute. I said, we're going to adopt, and she said, well, what are you going to do with the 4 kids you already have? It's like, well, I'm going to keep them and adopt another one. And she's like, really? And so anyway, something sparked her heart about it, and she decided to also adopt. And so she was adopting through Russia, and we were going to be adopting through Ukraine. And so time went on, we both prepared all of our paperwork, and there's so many things to do and accomplish, and it had been about 6 or 7 months that we had been doing all of this. And at the beginning of that, my friend had found a little boy that she felt drawn to as well. But at the end of that 6, 7 months of us preparing, it was almost time for her to go. Hers was going a little bit faster than ours. It was about time for her to go, and she got word from the orphanage that that child had been adopted and was no longer available. And so they had sent her a picture of another little boy. I still remember it really clearly. My friend came over and walked through the door, and she was showing me this picture of this little boy they had sent her. She's like, I don't know, what do you think? Like, it was just hard for her heart, because she had been dead set on this other little picture of this other boy that she was going to adopt. And I looked at the picture and I was like, oh, he's beautiful. He still has that light in his eyes. And as I said that to her, a very audible voice came to me and said, I am so glad you feel that way, because he will be yours. And I was kind of just stunned for a minute and just stared at the picture. And to be be honest, he looked so familiar to me, and my heart was just drawn to him. And I couldn't say a thing. Of course, I didn't say a thing to my friend, and she went home, and I didn't even say anything to Benji for a while. I just knew that we were adopting this other little boy from Ukraine, and my mind was just like, I don't know why that happened, why I felt that. So time went on, and it was time for my friend to go adopt this little boy from Russia, and still Ukraine wasn't quite there. It was going much slower. And so that day that she was bringing him home to the airport, I was on my way to an appointment with a friend. I was drawing houses at the time, and I was on my way to an appointment, and my mom called me, and she said, Tiffany, I don't know how to say this, but I feel it so strong in my heart. I feel like this little boy that your friend is bringing home is going to end up being your little boy. And I'm like, Mom! And I told her about the experience I had when I had seen his picture, and I just was crying and crying and just, what do I do? What am I gonna do? So I got to my appointment where my friend was waiting for me to draw her house, and I walked in, and I probably looked a little bit teary, but I sat down the plans on the table, and just boom, out comes from my friend's mouth, I feel like the little boy that we had a mutual friend, I feel like the little boy that they are bringing home is going to end up being your little boy. And I slammed my hand on the table, and I said, why would you say that? And she said, I don't know. I said it and almost just heard myself saying it. And I thought, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? This can't be. I don't know how I would even say that to my friend. I said, just a minute, I need to look at something. And I went over to the computer, and I pulled up all of the pictures of those children in that orphanage. And I pulled up the picture of the little boy that we had been working to adopt from Ukraine. And I just started crying, because it was so obvious to me that all of a sudden his picture, he didn't look real anymore. And it broke my heart, because I honestly didn't know what I was going to do at this point. So that night they brought him home to the airport, and all of my kids and all of that mutual friend that I was drawing a house, all of them came, everybody came to the airport to see this sweet little boy. And the whole time my heart was just pounding, and my stomach had that feeling like someone had punched me in the gut, I didn't know what I was going to do. And so time went on, and our friend had had him for a few days, and I didn't know what to do. I couldn't tell her these experiences. And so finally, I think she'd had him for about 3 or 4 days, and finally I just was at the end of what I could do. I had fasted, I had stayed up all night praying, and I had fasted that some miracle would happen. And as I was breaking my fast, my one friend came over that I had been drawing her house for, and I was like, hey, and I was just telling her, she said, have you told her yet? And I said, of course not, no. And I just was kind of just telling her I didn't know what I was going to do, but it was in the Lord's hands now. And I am not kidding you. My friend walked through the door. She didn't even knock. She walked through the door, and she said, can I please talk to you for a minute? And I looked, yeah, let's go. And we walked into the family room. So it was 3 of us that walked into my family room. And I sat down, and my dear friend, she started crying, and she just said, I don't know how to tell you this, but I had a dream that Ukraine was going to close, and that we were supposed to bring this little boy over for you, and that he's supposed to be your little boy. It still blows me away at what a miracle that was. And I said, oh my goodness, let me just tell you what I felt and what I experienced. And so we just held each other and sobbed. And I knew that Bridger would be my little boy at that point. We named him Bridger because my friend that brought him over was a beautiful bridge, and I'm sure there was many angels in connecting that all to happen. And so we named him Bridger. And let me just tell you something. While we were waiting that long road to adoption, I had learned just one word really in Russian, and it was I love you, and Libyan. That's how I pronounce it. I probably pronounced it really wrong. But anyway, that night when we went over, we brought Bridger to our house. He was playing and having fun with the kids, and he ran up to me, and I said, I'm going to be your mama. I'm your mama. You live here. And I was trying to do charades to explain to him And he got it, and he looked at me and he gave just me the biggest hug, and he said, "I'm here?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm Mama, and you here?" And he said, "I'm here?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Oh, Timmy Olivia Mama, Timmy Olivia Mama." And he just like held me around my waist, and he just looked up at me with his bright, sparkly brown eyes.
I had so much excitement. I remember like I hugged her and said like Kukla V. How do you pronounce it again? Kukla V. Kukla.
I think he
Kukla. Anywho, I said I love you, Mom, in Russian. As you can see, we don't speak Russian.
And I just knew that he was mine, and it was all very real right then. That my adoption journey had started with Bridger. Now about Bridger, he is I don't know, he is just the coolest kid. Of course, that first year of his adoption was rough. A lot of preconceived notions from first-time adoptive parents is that when you give a child a safe and loving home, that everything will just be perfect. But you have to remember that these kiddos have been through extreme trauma. And even though where they're at is not the best for them, you're tearing them from everything that they've ever known and everybody that they've ever loved. And so there is going to be hardship. Like, it's not going to be just like, oh, everything's perfect and I love you. And it was a rough year. In fact, I remember when we sent a post-adoption placement report back to Russia about how Bridger was doing, we had a worker come and talk to him about it. And we talked about all of the hard things that he had been through over the past year. And he explained it so cute. He said, well, it was kind of like I was asleep. That whole time, when we talk about those things I did, it was kind of like I was asleep, and then someone just turned on the lights. And he's like, and I was like, that's so true, because he had just adjusted so well and had stopped with those, those things that he had been doing. He just used to have such a hard time. And again, I don't want to share too many details because that's Bridger's story, and that's for him to hold close to his heart and maybe to share one day if he feels the need. But he is just such a great guy, and I love him so much, and he has worked so hard to rid himself of that trauma and to try to pull himself away from where that trauma naturally brings you. And I'm just so incredibly proud of Bridger and love him dearly. So then fast forward a year, and all right, guys, to talk to you about JourNee, I also need to talk to you a little bit about Lily. I had just adopted Bridger, and I loved adoption, and if you've watched part 1, you know why. And I had been speaking about the power of adoption and what it was to adopt and how special it was to families. So about 6 months after I adopted Bridger, I actually was crowned Mrs. Utah, and I was speaking everywhere about adoption and just the beauty of adoption. And when I would do that, oftentimes I would print off pictures just from like orphanages or sites of these beautiful children that needed a home. So I was printing off some of these pictures and scrolling through, and I found this little girl. And she literally jumped off the page, just like I talked to you about how you just feel like they look real. She looked very real to me. In fact, so real that I printed off all the pictures, but her picture I just kind of tucked in the top drawer of my desk because my heart was a little bit alarmed and a little bit like, I don't know, it was just very like I needed to protect that picture. So I tucked that picture away, and I tucked it away in my heart as well. And fast forward a few months, and I had been volunteering at a shelter home for little kids. It was kind of like where they would go for a week until they went to their families that they would be fostered by. And I was helping one night, and this little girl came a little bit late to the function, and she was just crying. And I saw her from behind, and she was about 3 years old. Now you kind of might know where this is going if you watched part 1. If you haven't, I would encourage you again to go watch that. But I saw her, and she was just crying, and she just wasn't having the activity we were doing. And the lady with her was just like, I'm not being short with her, but just like, okay, stop crying. And so I went over and I just said, what's the matter? What happened? Why are you crying? And she said, well, I went to the dentist and hair hurt my mouth. And She was just so sweet and so cute, and I just spent that hour with her, reading to her, and I just felt connected to her and thought that maybe she was the one. And so that night when I was getting her ready for bed, she didn't want to put on a pull-up because she was a big girl. And so I said, but look, Cinderella's on that pull-up. And so I said, have you ever heard Cinderella? And she's like, no. And I was like, you haven't? And so we put on her pull-up, and I said, have you ever heard her song? And she said, no. And I said, well, let me sing it. So I started singing to her, and I am not a good singer, but I was like, a dream is a wish your heart makes. And I started spinning her around, and she was like, what is this song? I love this song. She was just the cutest thing ever. And so my heart was like, oh my gosh, I think I found the little girl. Like, I thought I still have a little girl to adopt because of that experience I had making the strawberry jam, that I was like, okay, maybe this is her. So finally I was at the end of my rope, and I was just bawling and crying, and I was sitting down by the bottom of my bed on the ground just sobbing, and I just had the feeling the Spirit whispered to me, I need you to turn up the song that you hear playing. And I was like, okay. So I stand up and wiping off tears, and I turned up the song. And the song is To Be Held by Natalie Grant. So I stood up and listened to this song, and this is what this part said. This is what it means to be held, how it feels when the sacred is torn from your life and you survive. This is what it is to be loved, and to know that the promise was when everything fell, we'd be held. At that point, I knew that this was about the little girl that I would adopt. And at that moment, I was being held, and I had to have faith that she was being held until I could find her. And so then the word said, the wise hand opens slowly to lilies of the valley and tomorrow. At that point, I knew that tomorrow would come soon, and I knew that her name would be Lily. So at that point, I was like, okay, it's gonna happen in time. It's just not yet. And so maybe a week or two had passed, and I found myself in the shower just kind of asking Heavenly Father questions like, when is it gonna happen? And I know I'm supposed to find this other little girl. And popping in my head was, what about that little girl with the little crossed eyes that you had slid her picture in your drawer? What about her? And I thought, well, but that's not the 3-year-old Lily. No, but what about her? And I thought, well, interesting. And I started kind of thinking about her, and the phone rang. And normally I don't get out of the shower to answer the phone, but I felt like I needed to this time. So I jumped out of the shower and answered the phone, and it was a lady who I had not talked to for at least, I don't know, it's been like over a year that I had talked to her. And she said, hey, I just had the feeling to call you this morning. How are things going? And we kind of shared how things were going. She'd also adopted. And I said, they're going really good. And she said, oh, and she stopped for a second to talk to somebody, and then she got back on the phone, and she goes, oh, sorry, that was my neighbor. She is such a sweet girl. She just had crossed eyes, really bad crossed eyes from when she was a little girl, and they just did surgery on her a couple weeks ago, and she's just so beautiful, and her eyes are straight. And I'm sitting here thinking, why would my friend, who I haven't talked to for a year, call me, and maybe the third thing we talk about is a little girl with crossed eyes that got them straightened, and how wonderful it is for her, and how she can finally see the whole big picture. Anyway, my heart was like, I think the Heavenly Father's trying to tell me something. And so that night, Benji got home from work, and I called him into the office, and I said, honey, I just have to tell you, I have this picture of this little girl, and she looks familiar to me. And he's like, no. And I said, yeah, she does. He's like, how old is she? And I'm like, well, she's 8. And he's like, we already have 2 8-year-olds at that point. Bridger was 8, and so was Cassidy. And I'm like, I know, but she looks familiar. And I said, just look at her picture. And so I still remember Benji was like laid across, kind of sitting on the floor with his arm up like this, kind of holding his body up. And he reached up and grabbed the picture, and he looked for a second. He looked at me, and he's like, he sat the picture down, he like laid down on the ground, he goes, she does look familiar. I'm like, I know. We just knew we needed to find that little girl and adopt her, and so we did. It took us like 9 months, 10 months, we finally were able to go see her, and she was just a delight. She's so beautiful. If you know JourNee, you know that she just has this light in her that is so evident and obvious when you meet her, and she was just the cutest thing. She was showing Benji how she could jump rope and play with the soccer ball, and he was trying to teach her how to do the what's that called, honey?
The swing.
Oh, the swing. Oh, by the way, Benji's recording this. So he was teaching her the swing dance, and it was just so fun, and she was so sweet. And we were getting ready to leave, and we had to say goodbye to her because we had to go home for a few weeks and then come back to get her. That's kind of the rules. It was the rules back then. So as we left, there was this little foggy window about this big, and she put her little chubby hand on the window to say goodbye, and oh, my heart. And it was so hard to leave her for those few months and to come back and get her. But we had left her with a book, all the pictures of our family and her room would look like, and she clung to that book, I think, the whole time. Was so excited to look at it every day and know that we were coming to get her. And pretty soon it was time, and we were able to come and get her and to bring her home. And she's just the sweetest thing. I'm going to show you the video of us bringing her home right here because it's just so beautiful.
3,000 miles from home, trying to say that I will get there soon. 30 days I walk down this way, singing my madness to the moon. I met a cat on a tree, and it talked to me about things we don't see. I asked it, how do I know which is the right way to go to get me home? And it said, don't look for a reason, don't look for another way, 'cause anyway we'll get you home. You can't get lost if you don't know where you go, and anyway we'll get you home is the right way, they say, if you just go your way.
As you saw in that video, she used to hug everybody. She just was so loving from the start, and she was just, I don't know, just such a twinkle to our family, and our kids just absolutely loved her from get-go. They spent the night on the bottom of our bed the first night they were there on the floor, and it was just the sweetest thing. JourNee, if you know JourNee, anyone who knows JourNee just knows that she just has a heart of gold. She would never want to hurt anybody, and she just thinks the best of everybody, and she's just so close to nature and animals, and I don't know, JourNee is just so special. And how we came up with her name is I had KENNADEE and Cassidy at that point, and Bridger and Trey's real name is Bruce, so I had like two B's, and me and my mom were talking, and I'm like, well, Janie, like I don't have another J name for a girl. And we were talking about it, and she was like, what about JourNee? Because she's been on this long journey, and you've been on this long journey to find her. And I was like, JourNee, it's perfect. And so we named her JourNee. So a few months later, after our adoption was final, we decided to move 4 hours away. And so we did that, and I was vacuuming my floor of my new house, and I got interrupted by a phone call, and I answered it, and it was somebody from the DCFS, and they said, hey, I noticed that you started all of your paperwork for becoming a foster parent back where you used to live. Do you want to still do that here? I mean, we had just barely adopted JourNee maybe 4 months earlier, so I was like, no, I think we're good for a little while. And then that night I had a dream. To hear the rest of that story, you are going to have to watch part 3. You guys, thank you so much for watching all of these miracles that our family has experienced. Love you all so much. Bye-bye.
Feels completely empty when you're not in the wings. How could I have known the fortune I would find, a peace deep in my bones, the beauty day and night? and you make anywhere feel like home. Home isn't where we live, it's living by your side. Oh, and I can't imagine